Sebastian don't want to skip his talk and change it up for a discussion round, I hope so. Because we want to know more about PHPUnit and its many features. Yesterday evening he promised us up to 500 slides. So this would will be quite a challenge for us to listen and remember everything he will tell us about. So let's be surprised how many features we know already and use of PHPUnit and which we might get to know today. So give it up for Sebastian.
Again? Ah, okay. Testing works. So I'm not the 10x developer that was promised, so I only have 50 slides roundabout, not 500. Should I go now? Okay. So, hi, my name is Sebastian. I have some experience at certain things. The thing that I have the most experience with is being a Sebastian, so hi. This will be a boring name by the end of the day, and it is not useful to use as a primary key today to refer to speakers, because there are many Sebastians here. I'm doing things with computers since 1990. I started programming on the Amiga 500 with assembly and C, not necessarily in that order, and been doing things with PHP and PHP since 1998. It's also when I started to work on open source, and this year is the 25th year that I'm working on open source and on working on PHPUnit. Will I still do that in 25 years? I do not know. So at some point I have to talk about, or I have at least to think about, these hard topics that Juliette raised in her opening. As I already said, PHPUnit since 2000, and because open source does not put food on the table or a roof over my head, I need to do work that is not open source work. So I help, since 2009, companies build better software with PHP and related open source technologies, the PHP consulting company, and I help, together with my partners, PHP teams build better software, test their software, and so on, consulting, coaching, training. I'll get back to that later. So this presentation is a new one, and it's also a style of presentation that I have never done before, so you're my guinea pigs. Thank you for volunteering. Depending on how this turns out, I will do something like that again in the future or not. This presentation is inspired by a presentation that I watched a while ago, So You Think You Know Git. And I don't know why the name for this type of talk is Shotgun Buffet, but it is a shotgun buffet kind of talk, or maybe not, maybe I misunderstood the concept. What I want to do here today with this presentation is highlight a couple of PHPUnit features that have been around in some cases for a really long time, like 15, 20 years, and some features that were only recently added. Because over the last couple of years, I got a couple of times the question like, hey, what are features in PHPUnit that you think more people should know about, more people should use? Usually coupled with the questions, what are features that we should not use? I will not talk about the should not part today. I'm showing like a selection of features that I think more people should know about. Okay. And I have no idea how this will turn out, so here goes nothing. First chapter where I want to talk about features is related to code coverage. So code coverage is the software metric that tells you how much of your code you have tested. And In a lot of cases, it stops being useful if you have hit the 100%, because then, well, you know that you have at least a test for every line of code, and that may or may not be sufficient. It's usually not sufficient, but it's mostly useful if it's below 100%, because then it's very obvious where you either are missing tests or where you have code that you do not need. And in a lot of cases, when I see in my code coverage reporting that something is not covered, I just delete the code. It's usually better that way. So over the years, I added a couple of features to PHPUnit's code coverage functionality that help with keeping you honest, or helps you get an honest, more precise, more informative, more useful code coverage report. And this code example already shows two aspects of that. Bless you. There are two attributes that are used on this test case class. One makes the intent, or hopefully it makes the intent of the person who wrote this test case clear and obvious, both to a human reader who looks at this test. Hey, we are interested in testing something that is called a camera. But it also helps tools like PHPUnit itself, but there are also some other tools that do something through static analysis with this information here, that the tests of this test case class intend to verify the behavior of camera. The second attribute, small, documents the intent that this test, or the tests of this test case class, are supposed to be small, supposed to be unit tests in the original sense of testing only functionality of one unit of code in isolation from everything else. So what does PHPUnit do with that information? For starters, when we run our tests, it can give us a slap on our fingers when our tests do not do what we documented, what we intend the code to do, or what we intend the test to do. Like in this case, PHPUnit marks a couple of tests as being risky, telling us this test executed code that is not listed as code to be covered or used. So while we run the tests for the thing that we call camera, we also execute code from something that is called a matrix. And don't worry, I'm not going to go into all the math that you need to build a ray tracer. And don't ask why I built a ray tracer in PHP. Just don't. Otherwise, we will have a completely different discussion. But this is useful information because it tells us, hey, either you have not documented clearly what your intent is with this test, or your test is not good enough because you're using a dependency of the thing that you want to test, which is camera, and there is a conflict because it said this is a small test, a unit test that tests one unit of code in isolation from its dependencies, and currently that is not the case. So I can either change the type of test, make it larger, hey, this was a mistake, this is not supposed to be a unit test, this is an integration test, and then that would be fine. Or, oh, I forgot to add the information, the metadata that I expect, or that it is expected that code from some other class, namely matrix is called when this code is running. So that's okay. Or maybe, oh, this needs to be a unit test, and I do not want to run code from camera. I forgot to use a test stub for the matrix, which is something that you should not do for something that does matrix multiplication. But in this case, those are the three possible options. Only one of them makes sense, and that is adding another attribute and more metadata. Hey, it's expected from the tests of this test case class to also use code from matrix. So that is one thing that can happen. Now, if I look at my code coverage report, and one of the many reports that you can get is an HTML-based. This is what I personally usually use most of the time. And this is usually a good test for how good the projector is. So we will see about that. So PHPUnit has this idea of you can label or categorize tests to be small, medium, or large. You can see that there are different shades of green, right? A darker shade of green on the very left in the legend, covered by small and larger tests, covered by medium and large tests, and covered only by large tests or tests of unknown size. So if I run the test suite for this ray tracer thing and only run the large integration and end-to-end tests, then I only see code marked as being covered by tests in a light shade of green, because it's only covered by large tests. If I run only the unit tests for this application, I get a lot of lines of code that are executed by my unit tests, and they are shown in a darker shade of green. But line 116 is suddenly red. It's not covered by a test, because that line so far is only covered by a large test. And that information is only that at first. It is information. It's up to me as a human making a decision whether or not that is a problem. If I think this is a problem, this tells me, oh, there is a unit test missing that does something with regard to reflection and diffusion in shadows and whatever. Or I say, nah, I'm fine. I'm not in the mood of writing that unit test right now. I have it covered with an integration test, and that's good enough. It's usually not, but it's not something that really requires my immediate attention. And it's sometimes really good to look at how these tests overlap. At least I find that interesting. So, mentioned earlier that traditional code coverage starts to get useless once you hit 100%, because then it only tells you there's no obvious line of code that you are missing. But it's perfectly possible, and it happens a lot, in fact, that you have 100% line coverage, like you have a piece of code and you have tests, and all the lines are executed by at least one test, so you get 100% line coverage, and then still know, just by looking at the code, I mean, in this case, it's hopefully obvious, after looking at it for a couple of seconds and trying to figure out what's going on, I can't possibly have tested all the different ways that this unit of code can be executed. And in fact, there are approaches due to static analysis and mathematics, graph theory, to figure out how many possible execution paths do we have. And for this piece of code, there are 8 different ways that I can run through that code. And while I do have 100% line coverage, I'm only covering 1 out of the possible 8 execution branches. So I'm missing tests. And PHPUnit has a feature for that, built on top of Xdebug's branch and path analysis. Now, when I say it has this feature, it knows how many possible branching points there are and whether or not all the branches are covered, and it knows how many different execution paths there are and how many execution paths are covered by tests. So we can get statistics. But when it comes to visualizing which branches and paths are not covered, I am not happy at all with the current way that this information is visualized. Because this shows for the branches that is something that I can understand, because you just look at it for a couple of seconds and then it usually makes sense. For when it comes to paths, it usually takes me like 5, 10, 15 minutes of looking at this to remember how this was supposed to be. And this is believe it or not, this is a common way of displaying this type of information, and I can't really believe that nobody has come up with a better way of doing that. The only way that I know in theory that works is make a visual approach, like paint the path and the graphs and do it that way. Problem is that with real-world code, you quickly reach a point where you cannot really see anything useful in that graph anymore. So that is one practical problem, and different practical problems arise from the fact that performing this type of analysis is really expensive. It requires a lot of memory, requires a lot of CPU. If you really want to see where the raw data, you have to go to bytecode. This is what PHP bytecode looks like, in case you have never seen that. If you've ever, at some point in your life, seen assembly code, doesn't really matter if it's assembly code for Motorola 68K or for x86. The concepts are the same. This looks very similar. This is how PHP code is executed low level. And this is a tool called VLD, where this output is coming from. Another tool that Derek, the author of Xdebug, wrote. The VLD originally stood for Vulkan Logic Disassembler. At some point he changed what VLD stands for, but sorry, I keep forgetting that. It's either VLD or Vulkan Logic. And at the end, you see the branches and the paths, and you can visualize that. And for such simple code, you get a rather small graph, but in real life, code is more complicated than that, and this approach doesn't work. There are regulated industries where you are required by law to prove that you have 100% path coverage, but the tools that report this are closed source, cost 6 figures subscription fees per year, and they do not show you on the product page how this information is presented. That's nice. I should probably not do open source, but hey, I don't know. And the academic research that I've seen, they always say, yeah, this is good, but it's academic research and real-world projects. It does not look that simple if you look at certain WordPress or Drupal or pick your favorite off-the-shelf solution. And I don't mention these projects because I want to pick on them. Like, pick any real-world solution and you will have trouble. Okay, but that's all I wanted to say about code coverage. I'll come back to the topic of paths and how to deal with them in a different way towards the end. Now I would like to talk not about picking vinyl and putting some music on, but about selecting tests. Because most of the time, I see developers that only run all the tests all the time, and then sometimes they complain, oh, this is really tedious, I'm only interested in this one thing, and now I have to run all my 20,000 tests. No, you don't. PHPUnit has a lot of features for selecting which tests you want to run. So we need an example. And we're sticking with the test suite of that ray tracer that I wrote. And in case you are interested, not in why I wrote a ray tracer in PHP, but how, it's public, it's open source, it's on GitHub, just don't expect any support for it. It has a test suite, and I use that project to have an example project that is as real-world as possible when I want to talk about PHPUnit and explain certain things, or try out new features myself. Okay, so this is what our test suite looks like. We have a tests directory. The tests directory has 2 subdirectories based on the type of tests. So we have one directory for integration tests and one directory for unit tests. And then under the unit directory, we have some subdirectories that more or less match the directory structure of the code that we're testing. And this is what a PHPUnit XML configuration file looks like for this test suite. There's a lot of stuff stripped out. What is of interest to us right now is that there's a test suites element and that we can have more than one test suite element in there. And here we define, or we configure 2 test suites, one with the name unit, and configure that everything that looks like a test that is in test/unit belongs into the test suite named unit, and the same for integration. So on the command line, we can say PHPUnit -- list suites. And we get a list of the test suites that have been configured. And we see, okay, we have 2 test suites. One is named integration, one is named unit, one has 5 tests, and one has 172 tests. And in case you're wondering, but Sebastian, you're cheating, you're lying, PHPUnit 11.4.0 has not been released yet. Yes, that is true. It will be released 2 weeks from today. But while I was preparing this presentation material, I found it annoying that the output of list suites, for instance, does not list how many tests are in there. And I implemented that, and I put that in there. And then I saw, I'm lying, because that will be released in 11.4.0, and I can't show that. So I found a different way to lie to show that. So sorry about that. In 2 weeks, the lie will be gone, right? It's all a matter of temporal context. So -- list suites tells us, hey, these are the suites that you have. Usually, you do not have a large amount of suites. I've personally never had more than 4 or 5 suites that I have configured. I usually have unit, integration, edge-to-edge, end-to-end, and then have dependencies defined in my CI pipeline, run my static analysis first. If that is successful, run my unit tests. If that is successful, run my integration test. If that is successful, run the end-to-end tests. There's no point in trying to run the end-to-end tests when something before in the pipeline can already tell you it's broken. Yeah, if PHP Stan already tells me it's broken, why should I waste any resources in my pipeline on trying to run the test? It cannot possibly work. Of course, this is only useful if you can also tell PHPUnit, hey, please run only the tests from that test suite, and that's what I do. -- test suite, unit, it runs only the tests that are configured to be in the test suite unit. And because edge cases, you can also say exclude test suite. Because sometimes if you have like 4 or 5 test suites and you want to run all of them except one, that's why exclude test suite comes in handy. But you can use test suite multiple times and say, hey, test suite unit, test suite integration, and then tests from both test suites that you configured can be run. Test suites are not the only way of categorizing your tests that PHPUnit offers. So think of test suites as really the high-level organization of your tests, of your entire test suites. And here it's the focus is not on topic, like what part of my application am I testing, but what is the shape and size of my tests. That's where test suites really shine. But you need, or I usually need more than that to categorize my tests, and that's where groups come into play. A test, any test, can be part of one or more groups, and you put tests into groups, for instance, using the group attribute. And then there's also something called, do we actually have a name for it? If not, I'm making it up on the fly, like virtual groups, like the small, medium, and large that I mentioned earlier. Those automatically create groups for you. So list groups tells you, hey, the tests of these test suites, they are sorted organized into these test groups: canvas, intersection, material, math, shape, and small and medium, which have a special semantics attached to them with regards to the different shades of green, for instance, that we saw earlier. And you probably have already guessed it by now. You can use -- group, small, for example, to tell PHPUnit, hey, please only run the tests that are in this group. And consistency, even consistency with regard to handling edge cases. There is exclude group, run all the tests except those that are small. There's -- list tests, which lists the tests in more or less human-readable format. This comes in handy if you want to see, like, what are my tests? Once upon a time, I thought that this was good enough to build tooling around it, but I'll talk more about that in a second. Well, not in a second, but in the next segment. But this is useful if you're looking for a particular test, for instance, for filtering. So PHPUnit allows you to filter the tests that are being run based on the name of the test. So for instance, you can say -- filter and then fully qualified name of the test case class, for instance. Depending on your shell, you need to escape the \. Depending on your shell, you need to escape the \ and put it in single quotes. Your mileage may vary. I do not know about your terminal. I do not know about your shell. I do not know how you configured your shell. This is what I need to do, but it doesn't annoy me as much as you might have guessed by now, because I don't really use that this often. More often than not, I use this. And the reason that works is the argument that you pass to -- filter is, or it can be, a regular expression. If you pass a regular expression, all tests will be run for which the name matches the regular expression. If you do not pass a regular expression, behind the scenes a regular expression is created that basically amounts to substring matching. Right? So this will run all the tests where, in that casing, camera test is part of the test name. And the test name being matched is class name ; method name, and then certain things with the data providers. Wasn't it you, Volker, who implemented the syntax for the data providers? So with regard to data providers, you can do really fancy stuff like -- filter camera test, hash, ; method name, hash 10-20, and it will run data provider number 11 to whatever, because we start counting at 0, right? Yeah. I don't think that this is documented, but since I mentioned it just now, it might as well be. But we have tests for it, so it works. So, okay. And of course, you can just use the name of a test, and that will work just as well. This is rather new, like not new, built this year, like built, I don't know, in the last couple of years. And it's another feature that builds on the metadata that I showed earlier with the attributes for covers class, for instance. If you consistently use metadata to indicate what your tests are interested in, what your tests are verifying, then you can use that metadata to filter the tests that you are interested in running. So you could, for instance, say, hey, please run all the tests that intend to cover my camera. Or run all the tests that use camera, if you consistently use the use class attribute. I mentioned a couple of slides ago that once upon a time, for a very short period of time, I thought that list tests would be useful for doing automation and scripting and building tools. It wasn't. Because of the PHPUnit version number, whatever string that was output there. And yes, you can filter those first 3 lines out and then do your set, awk, whatever magic. I'm old school, I like XML. So I wanted a way to have a way to list the tests in XML format. And the interesting bit here is that it says at the end, wrote list of tests that would have been run to test XML. So you can use test suite, group, filter, whatever to perform the normal selection and write the list of tests that has been filtered out, right? So this is what the XML looks like. Don't worry, there's not going to be a test at the end of this. You do not need to know that format. You only ever need to worry about that if you want to build a tool, for instance, to partition your test suite, right? So if you want to run your tests in parallel or distributed on multiple machines, and you do not want to use an out-of-the-box solution for that, like Paratest or PHPUnit, if you want to do something like Andre and Markus have done for the PHP stand pipeline, for instance, then you can use this output, write a script that reads this XML, partitions the tests in a useful manner, and then runs separate PHPUnit jobs to run the different batches and combine the results from there. So that is what that is for. Next, I would like to talk about output, because you can customize the output that comes out of PHPUnit. And there, a lot has changed since PHPUnit 10, because in PHPUnit 10, we rewrote everything that has to do with output and logging after we introduce an event system in PHPUnit where everything is an event now, and all this output stuff works based on these events. So for instance, you can say, no progress. Some people really do not want to see all the dots and whatever, only want to see the results. There you go. Some people don't want to see results. So you can say no progress, no results. You will still see PHPUnit version number, runtime, configuration file, and resource consumption. Obviously, that is too much output. So you can have -- no output, and then there will be no output. So the shell exit code will, in all of these cases, be the same. Some people just don't want any output. They're only interested in the shell exit code. And who am I to judge and deny that feature? And it was really easy to implement, so it doesn't add complexity. That's good. This is my preferred output. When I write tests, especially when I'm doing test-driven development, when I get to work on new stuff, I usually, when I need to find the name for a test, which is important, especially if you're doing test-driven development, because if you do not know what a test should be named, then you do not know yet what you should do next. So you need to think, and hopefully you think for yourself, and don't talk to a robot. So I usually think from the output. What will the output look like when I run test docs? So test docs builds on the idea that the name of a test should be concise and precise and describe what part of the system this test is responsible for. You can think about it as executable specification or executable documentation when you run your tests. But for me, that's really useful. And it's probably The feature of PHPUnit that is the most underappreciated, the least known good features that you should know, call it what you will. I've seen in so many teams that this output is so valuable in communication between developers and non-developer stakeholders in the team. Developers can take this output, go to the domain experts and say, this is how we understood the requirements and this is how the software currently works. Did we understand that correctly? And then you can have a discussion with the domain experts based on that. You can go to a mathematician and tell him, hey, or maybe not for camera, but for the underlying functionality of a matrix and vectors and whatever, did I understand that correctly? Usually with examples from data providers and things like that, and you can have a meaningful discussion. This is also helpful for developers, because when I, as a developer in this project, need to work with the camera for the first time, what I usually do is I run the test, look at the test docs output, and get information, what is this thing responsible for? Hopefully it's only responsible for one thing, single responsibility, hello. But I get this bullet point list of things, okay. Constructing arrays through the center, yeah, maybe the language could be better here. I would have phrased this better, but I worked on, I built this ray tracer by following a book on test-driven development that uses a ray tracer as a subject from beginning to the end. And they proposed the test names, so I stuck with those. But I can read that and I see, okay, these are the responsibilities, this is the context, and behind every line here, and that's the most important bit, is a useful, executable example of how I work with that. Because this comes from running a test. And test code is example code for how the code that is being tested can be used. In order to be complete, I need to talk about --debug. --debug exposes all the events in a textual representation that happen under the hood while you're running your tests. So this is very verbose, and you can make it even more verbose and get memory and time profiling information in here, so you can see how much time has passed between two events, how much memory was used between two events, to, for instance, look for memory leaks and things like that while running your tests. This is very verbose, and I use that a lot in testing PHPUnit's test runner itself in an end-to-end fashion. I use this a lot to debug issues inside PHPUnit, but I also use this sometimes when I work in a project that is not PHPUnit related, just to see what is happening internally. Yeah, and you will get things like, yeah, PHPUnit was started, and by the way, it's this version and that version of PHP is used, and we're on that operating system. At some point, we have loaded the configuration, and then the bootstrap has finished. Then the data providers are called, and the test suite is loaded. Then the test runner starts, then we start sorting and filtering, and at the end, we decided that out of the 177 tests, only one test will be executed, and then the execution of that thing starts. We prepare the test, preparation is finished, the test has passed, executing the test has finished, and so on. And at some point, we get to the end and we see the shell exit code. This is useful if you run your tests, for instance, in a CI pipeline or somewhere else, and somewhere in the middle, execution just stops. Because PHP crashes, or an extension that you have loaded crashes, or some other error occurs and you want to know which test triggered that. --debug will tell you that. It will tell you that with a lot of verbosity that you probably don't need. So last time I was in a situation like that, I wrote on the fly like a 5-line subscriber that just subscribed to the event that a test is about to be started because I was only interested in that. And Tim and Volker are chuckling because probably they did something very similar recently. And I'm still thinking about whether that should be a built-in feature or not. But for that case, debug is just too much. But yeah, the big gun is already there. We just need to make it into a smaller tool. I need to have a look at my watch because this is a topic I had never expected that I would spend so much of my life with this topic, and I just got the sign that I only have 5 minutes left, so I need to talk really, really, really fast. Deprecations and other issues. So before PHPUnit 10, PHPUnit only had outcome. A test could pass, a test could error, a test could fail, a test could be skipped or incomplete or risky or warning or whatever. And that meant that if you had configured PHPUnit to treat deprecations or notices or warnings in a certain way, execution of the test would be interrupted at the first notice or deprecation, and that was not really good. So with PHPUnit 10 and forward and the event system, we now have a separation between outcome and issues that can happen. So a test can pass, but there are issues being recorded, and you have control over what happens with these issues. And this week, most notably yesterday on the train, traveling here, I had issues with regard to eStrict, because eStrict is now deprecated in PHP 8.4. Yeah, that was fun. I have only less than 5 minutes. So if we have code like this is our own code, this is our first-party class, and we call some third-party code in there. And we have our own trigger error thing to trigger a deprecation, and then we have our third-party code, maybe a Symfony library or something from Doctrine. They are really consistent in how they signal that they're using something that is deprecated at runtime. And we have our test. We can run and we have our XML configuration file where we tell PHPUnit, this is my source code, everything that is in the SRC directory. I want to ignore the suppression of deprecations, which means I want to ignore the ampersand, the error suppression operator, the shut up operator, whatever you want to call it, in front of the trigger error. I want to ignore direct deprecations, and I want to ignore indirect deprecations. Then I get this output. One test triggered one deprecation in first-party code triggered by this other thing. And PHPUnit knows for each deprecation that is triggered who owns the code where the deprecation was triggered. Is this your own code or third-party code? Who called that code that triggered the deprecation? Was it third-party code that called third-party code? Was it first-party code that called first-party code? Was it first-party code that called third-party code? You get the idea. I have less than 4 minutes left. And this gets, usually you are only interested in what is called self-deprecation. First-party code calling first-party code, because that's what you can that is what you can do something about immediately. PHPUnit now has for a while now has a baseline feature. For instance, if you run your tests and you get lots of deprecations, you can tell PHPUnit, please write all those deprecations to a baseline file and do not bother me about this again. Of course, this is not how this is meant to be used, but let's face it, that's how most people use the Psalm baseline and the PHP Stan baseline, and that's also how they use the PHPUnit baseline. If used correctly, this is a really great tool. Use it. And if you use the baseline, then everything is green, but 4 issues were ignored by the baseline. Best practice configuration. PHPUnit has a CLI option generate configuration that will always give you the latest and greatest. They have to be great, right? Because they come from me. What I currently think the base for your XML configuration file for PHPUnit should be. It asks you a couple of questions like where is your autoloader, where are your tests, where is your source code root, and where do you want to store the cache. And then it generates that for you. And unfortunately, I do not have the time anymore, sorry about that, to go through what all of these things mean and why I think that they should be in your XML configuration file. But I'm here all day. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask those questions. Some people, especially from outside of Germany, frequently tell me that this best practice recommendation is very German because it's very strict. You basically tell PHPUnit to complain to you a lot. I do this with the best intentions of making your tests better and configuring PHPUnit to help you more. I do know and I do realize that not in all circumstances, certainly not in a legacy project, all of these things are useful. So these recommendations are for modern code where you do not have a problem with things like that. In closing, there's an ecosystem around PHPUnit. For the longest time, people already wrote extensions for PHPUnit, but we did not really have a good way of hooking into PHPUnit. And that changed with PHPUnit 10, and since then, more and more extensions are coming up. So one extension which is also good to look into its code if you're thinking about writing your own extension for PHPUnit. Maybe you want completely different output. Hey, write a new output printer to replace PHPUnit's output. PHPUnit's load test detector, you put it here. Just need to say, hey, I want this extension to be loaded, and then you can configure some values. And then you run your tests, and then you get at the end like a list of all the tests that took longer to run than the threshold you configured. So if you're interested in finding slow tests, this is one way of doing that, and it's a convenient way of doing that. When I talked about code coverage, I mentioned branch and path coverage, and then I would come back to that. There's a different approach when it comes to finding out whether or not your tests are good, whether you're testing everything, and that's infection. That does mutation testing. It runs your tests, and if all tests are currently green, it tries really, really, really hard to break your code by manipulating it, and if at least one test fails after such a manipulation, that's good, because that killed the mutant, and your tests are good enough to catch that. But if all tests still pass, then you have a problem, or you might have a problem. There are things like para-test for running your tests in parallel. There's also PHPUnit. And I don't want to sound like a broken record, and most certainly I do not want to try to sound like Juliet, but I'm not going to imitate your voice, that's what I meant. Your lovely voice, right? So, you cannot buy PHPUnit, but you can pay for PHPUnit if you want. If you want your company's logo to be listed on phpunit.de, there are ways to achieving that. Find out below. The best way, probably, because it benefits you and me, is to contract me for consulting, coaching, training. And that's something that you can do, that we can talk about. If you go not to that QR code, but to the URL behind that QR code, we have a gift for you. The pandemic turned our life around. Yeah, before the pandemic, I usually worked exclusively on-site with customers. Now I almost exclusively work remote, and we do a lot of open training, for instance, on architecture, software design, modern PHP development, testing, all the good stuff. And you can book our trainings individually, like traditionally, against money. This amount of money gets you a seat in this training. We have a flat rate where the company purchases a subscription and can put a developer into all of our trainings, and we currently offer over 250 hours of interactive training every year. And there's a new thing that we are now starting where you can get into our trainings using credits, and we are maybe behind that QR code, if the software works, I don't know, are giving away some credits to get a sneak peek into our training. Okay. Now I have -5 minutes left. I'm sorry about that. Thank you. If you have any questions, feel free to grab me at any point during the conference. It would be my pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sebastian. I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions, and the other ones have to wait, apparently. So has anyone a question for now? Anyone? So you are all overwhelmed. Oh, there is one in the second row.
Hello.
Hello.
So you said you have tests for PHPUnit, testing the test framework. Do you use PHPUnit to test it? And did you ever have a bug in PHPUnit that was not found because of bug in PHPUnit?
Yes, and maybe. So yes, PHPUnit is tested using PHPUnit in a combination of regular tests that you probably know how they would be written, and then some tests that are not so common. So PHPUnit can run PHPT tests. PHPT is the test framework that the PHP project uses to test PHP. And I use PHPT for end-to-end testing of the command line tool of PHPUnit. So I try to test as much as possible through unit tests and other smaller tests. But there are things that I can only test when I simulate or really call PHPUnit in a given directory with a specific XML configuration file and with CLI options, especially everything that deals with configuration file and CLI options. Because when PHPUnit runs its own test suite, it has its own PHPUnit XML configuration file. And that has already been loaded, and the test runner has been configured to use that. And for basically for everything that is affected by the XML configuration file, I need a separate PHP process with that fresh configuration. And that's what I use PHPT for. And we have some tests that are always run at the very start, especially in CI, to make sure that, probably just out of paranoia, but that things like assert true work. Yeah.
So, one question there.
What is your opinion about the test case from Laravel when you are using the dependency injection and instead the database connections in this stuff? Is it a sacrilege?
Is it?
Is it if the PHPUnit told in the past database connections are not the stuff of PHPUnit, and now it's possible with Laravel test case, and is it a problem for you? What's your opinion about?
As long as you don't make it my problem, when something goes wrong there, I'm perfectly fine. But to give you a more serious answer, PHPUnit cannot, and I fundamentally think should not, provide out-of-the-box support for certain frameworks. And it has always been the case that frameworks come with their own framework-specific functionality on top of what PHPUnit provides out of the box. So it makes a lot of sense that Laravel wraps PHPUnit framework test case. If you still want to use PHPUnit with Laravel, if you're not going all in and use PEST, for instance, then it makes sure, a lot of sense for Laravel to provide this, and for developers that use Laravel to build their applications to use that, because it's very convenient to be able in a test to say, hey, I need something that looks like Laravel's queue. I need something that looks like my persistence layer, and so on and so forth, and configure that on the go. Underneath, all of that uses PHPUnit, but they provide the mapping between the Laravel world and the basic functionality of PHPUnit.
The best one of that, you do not have to mock so much classes, and you got the whole aggregate from the database. Okay, thank you.
So thank you for your talk and for us to be in your Gainier Peaks. I think we all enjoyed it. And
That's good.
next up will be another Sebastian. But before that, we have a 15-minute break again. Yeah, so see you soon.